Good evening. Thank you all for coming tonight. It is really a pleasure and an honor for me to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Bruce T. Martin. And I'm going to ask you, this T stands for what? Thomas. Okay. Well, we met the first time 5 years ago, and ever since we started this journey together of research, exchanges, and finally an exhibition and also an online catalog that I would invite you all to download for free and just to read our remarks. As for tonight, Dr. Bruce T. Martin is going to present on Holy Beauty or Unholy Marriage, Discovering Provinance and Socio-Theological Musings on the Hexham Abbey Bible. Well, Dr. Bruce Martin has a very interesting combination of professions indeed. His curriculum vitae is quite unique, I would say. First of all, he's an independent scholar, a theologian, the owner of the Bible, as well as all engravings displayed in the Hallie Ford Museum. So I am personally very, very grateful for all your general support. And he has received his BA in Science and Religion from the Temple University in Philadelphia. In 1980, he has ordained into the Lutheran Church as a Master of Divinity. 2 years later, in 1992, he became a Doctor of Theology, presenting a dissertation on interreligious dialogue at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. He has presented papers at several conferences organized by the American Academy of Religion, including papers delivered at the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago. Now, the part that I was personally very surprised, our own Charlie's Angel. From 1995 to 2005, he has become a private investigator, and I really think that methodologically speaking, that has to do with his curiosity and the spirit of investigation and research indeed. Since 2005, he became the founder and the owner of the Historic Bibles and Engravings, and his current research focuses on the rise of resurrection faith in early apostolic history and the search for fundamental principles and causes. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bruce T. Martin.
Thank you, Ricardo. Let me begin by asking a question. How many of you have actually been to the museum to see the exhibit? Oh my God. Almost all of you. That's terrific. Well, I have a secret for you. This Bible is the actual cause for me to have purchased the Hexham Abbey Bible. This Bible is a first edition, 1629 King James Bible, printed in Cambridge, England. And it is said that this is the most beautiful English Bible ever printed. And that's one reason why I collect these Bibles. You can take a look at it afterwards if you like. When I first entered the exhibit a couple of weeks ago, I tell you, my heart virtually stopped when I stood before Hexham Abbey Bible, under glass, in the dimness of that little room. I suddenly felt that I saw the Bible in a different light. I felt as if I was standing before a glacier that was 2 miles high, and I felt so very small and humble, and can't believe that I've been honored somehow, somewhere, to have purchased this Bible and to have owned it for a short period of time. For that very experience, I want to thank especially Ricardo for all of his very hard work these past 5-6 years. I want to thank John Olbrantz of the museum, and of course, Andrea Faust, whom I now know has a very cheerful personality, even in crisis. I appreciate that. And if there are any of Ricardo's students here, I deeply, deeply appreciate you also for all the hard work that you've put into this. Now, my purpose this evening is to examine the Hexham Abbey Bible from a theological point of view, while still respecting the fact that it is, in fact, a work of art. And yet, it's beautiful. For sure it's beautiful. It has to be beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful Bibles ever printed. And, in addition, there are exquisite engravings added to it. How could it not be a holy beauty? And yet, I'm a theologian. And I have to question, and I do question, whether or not pictures belong in Bibles. And yet we are presented with this Hexham Abbey Bible. We have no choice. It is there in front of us. And so the question of whether pictures really do belong in Bibles is an open one. And that's the question I'd like to explore with you today. It comes as no surprise to anyone that pictures very often do go with the printed word. We remember as children how we learned to read. And as young adults, when we learn biology and such things, that this combination of words and pictures do very often go together very well. In fact, it's the correspondence between words and pictures that makes these things work for us, that makes them so powerful. But the question is, and by the way, please don't try to strain your head here. We'll get to it right side up sooner or later. The question is, does the same thing apply to the Bible? Do pictures belong in a Bible? The correspondence between the pictures and the biblical text, then, is all important. So I'm going to take you on a little trip, the same type of trip that I've taken these past 5 or 6 years. And I want to talk, first of all, about the power of communication and how that creates civilization. I then want to talk about the Hexham Abbey Bible in its historical context amongst all other early English Bibles. I'll talk about the discovery, of course, and the Provinance, who put it together and why. These are all important questions. And finally, I want to dive deep into 3 of the Hexham Abbey Bible engravings that I believe speak for the Bible as a whole. And I hope through this process that we'll be in a better position, each one of us, to come to some kind of a decision of whether or not pictures really do belong in Bibles. So let's begin. What is communication? Now you may snigger to yourself at this. What? When I encounter a huge problem about humanity, my go-to person is the caveman. And why is that? It's simply because this cave family, unlike us, is unencumbered by any of the noise and confusion and inundation of information that we get every day. There is no writing here. There are no newspapers, no TVs, no movies, no internet. And yet, something about them is important because how did they get to be us? There must be something fundamental about this people that makes civilization possible. I believe that there are 2 fundamental building blocks to civilization. They are words and tools. And we need to think of words and tools here in a very global sense. Words, for example, such as the Ten Commandments. Words such as the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence. These are words that form the basis of our civilization, and without which we could hardly have a cohesive society. Things would be more chaos than order. And the same goes for tools. And here I'd like you again to think in terms of a global sense of tools. For sure, our bodies and our fists are tools, but also hammers, and even such things as the pyramids, the Colosseum, the Mona Lisa, the International Space Station, my personal favorite, toilet paper. Probably one of your favorites. But these things didn't fall from the sky. They came from someplace, and they came from the human brain, didn't they? How do we think? We think in pictures. Now, people who study these things, who think about thinking, tell us that it's absolutely impossible to think about something without also thinking in pictures. Our ideas and our pictures go together. You see where I'm going here? Text, ideas, pictures, Hexham Abbey Bible. Get it? Okay. So we think in pictures. Now, let's be honest. Not all of our thinking in pictures is as good as the next. We have these pictures in our minds. Some are good and some are not so good. The best of these pictures, these word pictures that we form in our minds, are the things, are the building blocks of civilization, such as the Ten Commandments, Magna Carta, and so on. Now, I believe that one of the most significant things that has ever been said by humanity comes from the first pages of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, this sentence is so very powerful, not simply because they are words, but there's certain types of words. They're metaphors, they're word pictures that evoke things in our minds and become very, very powerful because of that. So the more metaphorical our language is, the more powerful it is. And what do we do with these word pictures that we have in our mind? We string them out, we string them together, and they become a story. Now, there are small stories and larger stories, but eventually we end up with a story of civilization. And when we add the tools that we make, civilization is a virtual certainty. So storytelling, I believe, creates culture. Now, let's take a look at our friend over here, our ancestor. There's a lot of things going on in his mind. All these stories churning in there. He's thinking perhaps of the hunt that just ended and the kill that his clan just made. But he's also thinking about all the stories that his father told him about previous hunts and how to make the type of tools that are more beneficial for the hunt. And maybe he's even thinking of the great feast that's yet to come on the basis of this hunt. And maybe he's also thinking about the meat that will be left over that can be dried and stored for the winter. After all, the future is important to him. He has information that he needs to transmit from one generation to the next. But think again about these stories that are in his mind. And he crystallizes these stories into what he's drawing on the wall. Now, after this man is long dead, what do we have? We have the pictures on the wall. But we have no clue, no idea of what goes behind the drawing of that picture. All those stories that are untold. that go into the drawings. And so there are untold stories that are in a text, a story, and there are untold stories yet in the pictures that we see. The same is true in the Hexham Abbey Bible. In the biblical text, unless we have some clue, some understanding of what goes on before, it's very difficult to get a grasp on the story that's before us. Because after all, it's only a slice of this grand movie of which the stories and the pictures are just a frame in that movie. And so there's a double problem here. Unless we pay attention to the stories that precede the text and come after the text, and the stories that precede the actual engravings that we have, then I'm afraid we're sort of like David going up to battle against Goliath, but we've forgotten to put the rock in our sling. So here we have another problem also. A generation gap. These are the baby boomers, and these are the know-it-alls. So now let's skip about 80,000 years and take a look at how the Hexham Abbey Bible fits in to the history of early English Bibles. The very first English Bible to be printed is this Tyndale 1526 New Testament. It's actually quite a beautiful thing. But what I want you to notice here is this picture woodcut. Now this picture woodcut, blown up over here, thank you, Andrea, is a picture of St. Luke, the writer of the Gospel. And below him is a picture of a bull, which is his symbol, which doesn't mean that what he wrote is a bull. That's just his symbol. But the important thing here is that this picture bears no relationship whatsoever to any of the text. None. It's just there for ornament. And so it goes throughout the Tyndale New Testament. There are very few of these, but they all bear no relationship to the text. Now, after Tyndale came the Coverdale Bible of 1535, and then the Great Bible, 1539, the Bishop Bible of 1568, and they all have this in common. They had these picture woodcuts which tell a story, or a part of a story. But unlike Tyndale, they all bear a direct relationship to the story. So you can take a look at these woodcuts and your eye is drawn to them, and then you get to read. They're not terribly big, as you can see. But they do assist somewhat in orientating yourself to the story in that particular part of the Bible. Now, there were folks in England at that time who didn't like the idea of putting pictures in Bibles. And they came to be known as the Puritans. But these guys went off to Geneva, Switzerland, and made their own Bible. And in their Bible, they had nice maps, like the one that you see here. They had images of temple furniture, especially in the Old Testament, of course. But never, never, never do they have story pictures. No picture woodcuts at all, whether they fit into the Bible or not. They just don't exist. Now, the Roman Catholics didn't want to be left out of the party translating into English. So there were some folks in Reims, France, who came up with their version of the Bible in English. And what I want you to notice here is that they have some initial woodcuts. And very often you'll find in these Bibles that the initial woodcuts, as opposed to the picture woodcuts, bear no relationship at all to anything in the Bible. For example, here you can probably make out that there's a gentleman sleeping on the side of the road or something. Well, there's nothing in the Gospel of Matthew that has anything to do with that, at least not in this part of the Gospel of Matthew. It just was a nice picture woodcut to put in that particular place. Publishers did that. Now we come to the King James Bible of 1611, probably the most massive, well-known English Bible that's ever been printed. And it also follows, like the Reams Bible, having these initial woodcuts. Again, there are no picture woodcuts in this Bible, ever. But this initial woodcut is interesting because, as you can see here, there are some horses, and there's a fellow with a trident. You kind of wonder, well, where did that come from? There's certainly nothing, again, in the Gospel of Matthew that has anything to do with these horses and the man with a trident. This initial probably came from a book about mythology, and the publisher just stuck it in there because it was pretty. So we see that publishers like to make their Bibles pretty, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's what everybody did. Now, just to put the Hexham Abbey Bible in context, I'll give you a picture of it here. And I simply wanted to point out that the Bible itself was printed in 1629, but the engravings come from a different time period altogether. Unlike any other Bible, its pictures come from the latter part of the 1500s, which is unique. Now, the closest thing probably to the Hexham Abbey Bible is this one that's called a Peaks Bible. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of the inside of it. I wish I did. But from what I read about what's inside it, a fellow by the name of Robert Peake had the bright idea. He was a publisher. He was also an engraver. And his idea was to sell his engravings by putting them in Bibles. Because after all, the Bible was the most widely bought book in the world. But in Peake's Bibles, in this 5-year period, 1633 to 38, he has his own engravings, which are really not so good, and some early 17th century plates and maps. Well, this experiment really didn't last very long because the population believed that all these pictures were kind of poopish and maybe contravene the second commandment against graven images. So this died out. There are about a dozen of those things remaining. In 1660, things changed dramatically. And John Ogilvie, like Robert Peake, had the bright idea of gathering together lots of images and putting them in Bibles and selling them. And in 1660, he bought up all the Cambridge Bibles that were printed. And he stuck all these nice engravings into it, and they sold like hotcakes to the wealthy, of course. And from that moment on, English society just loved pictures in Bibles. Now here's an example of what happened after 1660. Engravings such as these were put in Bibles everywhere. Maybe 50, 70 of these engravings were put in Bibles, and people like them very much. They do bear a direct relationship to what's going on in the text. Okay, so what's so special about the Hexham Abbey Bible? Well, the engravings that are in it are not simply added into it. They're not tipped in, they're not pasted in, but rather somebody took the Bible apart and put the engravings inside and then re-sewed it and then rebound it. So that what we have here is something that really, you just can't buy off the shelf. This is a one of a kind. In fact, whoever did this took very special care that the particular edition of the 1629 Bible that had very, very thin linen rag paper was exactly the same kind of paper that the engravings were printed on. throughout such a great period of time. So it looks like it was made for the job. So the unique thing about this is that this is the earliest English Bible that has engravings, and it is the only English Bible that has engravings going back to the 1500s. So here, this is just to put all these Bibles and some more into a bit of a context. But the point that I want to show you here is that the Hexham Abbey Bible is strange because its text, again, was printed in 1629. Its engravings were printed, back in the late 1500s. And just as a little hint here, it was probably put together around 1660. So the 3 time periods going into the creation of this Bible. Now to the discovery. As I told you before, I love the 1629 Cambridge Bible. It's the one on the right. Now, before that time, the king's printers had a monopoly, and they made things like this. What was needed was an editorial revision because language changes over time, and a larger Bible was wanted, and especially a Bible that had a good quality of paper. And the Cambridge Bible actually printed 7 different editions of different qualities of paper so that they could sell to a lot of different people. Now, the interesting thing to note here, and this will become very important, is that in 1629, this first edition Cambridge Bible did not print a Bible as just an Old Testament. Almost every year, the printers did a whole Bible, and they did also a New Testament for those who just wanted a New Testament. But that didn't happen this year. You had to buy the entire thing. Old Testament, the Apocrypha, and the New Testament. All in one package. So, when an auction came up that very strangely only said 1629 New Testament, I was very, very curious. I wanted this Bible. There was not a single word in the advertisement about any engravings, just that it was the 1629 New Testament. I wanted it. I placed my bid for it, and I ended up with it. So it arrived at home. I was very excited. I placed it on my desk. I opened it up. I took it out. And I flipped the pages from the New Testament on. Whoa! What is this? I've never seen such a thing before. And keep in mind, I knew nothing about engravings. 0. I'm not sure that I'd ever seen an engraving before in my life. But here I had a Bible that had this engraving in it. Okay? So I turned the page and another engraving, and turn it and another engraving. 7 engravings in a row. What is this? This doesn't belong. The engravings are stuck in there. How did they get there? And so I quickly flipped through the rest of the Bible there, and there were, turns out, 118 engravings. Wow. So I knew that this was something different and special. So I did what I do best. I did some research. I went to the internet. And when I went to the internet, first of all, I found out that these kind of engravings just don't jive to the 1629 period, because at first I thought, well, they were put in 1629. This is a 1629 Bible. But that turned out not to be the case. There was some indication that they were older than 1629. So I went to Reed College, and in their library they had these very nice, probably here at Willamette University also, but Reed College, they had what's called the Holstein, or New Holstein set. which describes virtually every engraving that's ever been done. And so I looked these engravings up throughout that whole series one day and found out that these engravings, most of them come from the late 1500s. What am I to do with this? This is novel. So I called up the Portland Museum of Art, talked to the curator there, made arrangements to go see her. I took the Bible over there, and I showed it to her, and she said, wow, these are genuine. Yeah, you've got something here. But Bruce, I'm sorry, I've only been on the job for 4 days. I don't even know what's in our inventory. And besides, this is not even my area of expertise. But I do know somebody who knows about these things. That's Ricardo. So within a week, I went to see him. And I laid the Bible in front of his desk. And he opened up and he looked at me and said, I know these guys. These are my friends. And he started to give me the very first art history lesson I've ever had. And it was very illuminating. And it became intensely obvious at this point that what we had here was not just a Bible and not just a set of engravings, but we had a combination that probably was unique, but we weren't really sure, of Bible plus engravings. That's what makes this so special. So, we plotted the exhibition over a couple of cups of coffee. Now, Ricardo, being the professor that he is, said to me very quickly, Bruce, there are 3 stories here. There's the story of the Bible itself, which you know something about. There's the story of each of these engravings, which I know something about. And then there's the story of the compiler, which neither one of us knows something about. We need to find out who that is. It also occurred to me that there's a 4th story, and that is the person who actually opens up the Bible as it is and reads it with these engravings there. So that's kind of my interest. But nonetheless, we had to get to the compiler before we could do anything else. Okay, so who put this thing together and why? I'm going to go through this pretty fast because time is pressing, but you can look at it in more detail on the website. All right, who made it? When and why was it made? Why in the world are we calling it the Hexham Abbey Bible? Very venerable name. Open up the Hexham Abbey Bible, and we have what we believe to be a prayer book Bible for public worship. And how do we know that? There are 3 main sections to this Bible. The Book of Common Prayer, which was in virtually every Bible that was ever made back in those times. It is the worship book of the Church of England. There is the New Testament, which of course has all the readings in it that are read during Sunday worship. And then there's the whole book of Psalms, which basically is the hymnal of the period. And so putting these things together, we have what seemed to be obvious to us, a worship book Bible. By the way, I want you to notice how very clean these titles are. And that simply shows that the Bible itself is it's the cleanest Bible I have ever seen in my entire life. Not hardly a mark on it. So now we need to know who put it together. In order to get to that, we need to take a look at the engravings. And when we look at all the engravings that are in the Hexham Abbey Bible, we find one here that, luckily for us, is dated 1568. Now that doesn't always mean that this engraving was actually printed in 1568, but it's got Gerard Yodi's signature down here, so we know precisely that it was, in fact, printed at this time. Now, interestingly enough, this particular engraving is part of a series of 4 plates called The Parable of the Tares, and it is very, very famous. Very famous. So I'm very glad it's in there. Secondly, I want you to notice this engraving here. This is all one engraving. It has two parts to it, but it's all on a single sheet. And these engravings, and there are a couple in the Hexham Abbey Bible, are dated somewhere between 1639 and 1643. So we know for a fact now that the Bible had to have been put together after 1643. Now, just as an aside here, I want you to take a look at this particular engraving. It's an engraving of the resurrection of Jesus. This is important because out of 118 engravings in the Bible, out of 27 books in the Bible that all presuppose the resurrection, this is the only thing we get about the resurrection, and that's a half page, or about 1/200th of what was possible to put in there. That will become important. Now, clue number 2 as to when it was put together comes from the fact that, as I mentioned, the Bible itself is in near pristine condition. So it's almost like it was created and put on the shelf for the next 350 years. What could have caused somebody to do that? Well, it turns out that in 1662, a new Book of Common Prayer came out. And since the Hexham Abbey Bible is a prayer book, but it has a 1629 Book of Common Prayer in it. And so in 1662, all other prayer books became obsolete. Past that. You just can't use it for public worship. So maybe, just maybe, whoever put it together on the cusp of the printing of a new Book of Common Prayer, found that it was of no use any longer, put it up on a shelf. But there's another clue. Open up the Bible, and in the front cover, there is this very nice bookplate. And there's a little egret up here. Can you all see this? Really? You can see that? I'm impressed. I really am. So I blew it up for you. Okay. So we have a name down here, the Reverend Robert Clark. Reverend Robert Clark. I mean, in England, that's kind of like John Smith. How are you ever going to pin this guy down? Well, fortunately, this little egret over here, who looks like he's playing with a soccer ball, but it's not really a soccer ball, it's actually a cannonball, identifies the owner of this book, or actually the family of this book. And that turns out to be Robert Clark's father. And he has a very unusual name, and that is Slaughter Clark. You'll have to be named Slaughter Clark. Wow. Okay, so here's Slaughter Clark, father of Robert Clark. And these guys are clergy persons or lecturers at Hexham Abbey. That's where Hexham Abbey starts coming in here. Now, Hexham Abbey by this time is 1,000 years old. Actually, over 1,100 years old. So this is a very important church in England. And these guys are lecturers at this abbey. But that doesn't quite get us to 1662. Possibly the person who put this together, George Ritschel, was a lecturer at Hexham Abbey at that period of time. The period of time 1567 to 83, when he died. Okay, so who is George Ritschel? We're following the clues. Now, don't get confused here. This is an example of what not to do. You've got an engraving that bears no relationship to the words on the side. And so the words on the left-hand side do not tell you anything about the engraving, and vice versa. And this is not George Ritschel. By the way, he was born 402 years ago yesterday. George Ritschel. He was born in Bohemia in a solidly Lutheran family. Lutheran, keep that in mind. After he graduated from college, Very smart guy. In fact, it's been said that he is the smartest individual ever to have emigrated from Bohemia to England. Very smart. He became, and by the way, he learned from Comenius, Jan Comenius here. Whoops, sorry about that. There you go. He learned about education from Comenius. So he became later on headmaster of a grammar school, and after that he became lecturer and curate at Hexham Abbey. So that's basically his professional career. But let's take a look at this fellow by the name of Jan Comenius. Very formative person for George Ritschel. Comenius had this bright idea. And remember, this is back in the 1600s. He had this bright idea that if you took a text that a child would read and put an image next to it that bears a very close relationship to that text, you would have greater understanding on the part of these young children. Now get this. Text and images. Bible engravings. Well, my. To quote Detective Kent. You have great understanding when the text and the images say the same thing. And when they don't say the same thing, you end up with this. But when they do say the same thing, you end up with All right, George Ritschel is also a political animal. I'll go through this very quickly. He was headmaster of a grammar school because that's what he learned from Comenius. In 1657, a position opened up at Hexham Abbey. His son was born. He needed money. He was Lutheran, but you had to be Puritan in order to be a preacher here at Hexham Abbey at this time, in 1657. So he signed a loyalty oath to Oliver Cromwell, and that basically said, yeah, okay, I'm Puritan. Okay, you're good, you're hired. All right, so he was hired at Hexham Abbey. Then in 1660, something else happened. The king, who had been at war against Parliament, came back from exile, Charles II. And he was Anglican. Now what did that mean? It means that all the big churches in England had to be Anglican. So poor George Ritschel, he really wanted to be Lutheran. He was forced to become Puritan, sort of. Now he's got to become Anglican. How's he going to do that? He wrote a book. He wrote a book to his boss. And the book says, here's what I think about the Anglican Church. This makes me Anglican. And it's a defense against superstitions and idolatries, which of course is what the Puritans were all up in arms about. So, yeah, I'm an Anglican. Now, in this book, Ritschel dedicates it to John Cousin, his boss. Who's John Cousin? He was a clergyman who was kicked out a few years earlier. He was exiled. He was chaplain to the king. When the king came back, the chaplain came back. They made a new book of common prayer. He was involved in that. And he was rewarded by becoming a bishop. Ritschel's boss. Very important. So now, how do you convince somebody who is Anglican from keep you on at Hexham Abbey, like plum assignment, even though you seem to be kind of Puritan? Well, you have to convince them that you're really Anglican after all. And I believe that what he did was he wrote his book supporting Anglicanism. He put together what we now know as the Hexham Abbey Bible with the intention of giving it to John Cousin, his boss, so that he could keep his job. Well, it turns out, of course, the new Book of Common Prayer came out and made this passé, so he put that up on the shelf. But he did have his book, and he did keep his job. He wrote several more books after that and lived happily ever after. Not only that, but his son, George Ritschel Jr., became also a lecturer at Hexham Abbey. All right, now let's take a dive into some of the engravings, 3 in fact, from the Hexham Abbey Bible, and take a look at it from several different points of view. Remember, the question is, should pictures be in Bibles? Now, this is not a question any longer of idolatry. That ship has sailed. This is now a question of interpretation, which is always a question when someone opens up the Bible to read it. It's also a question when a person looks at an engraving to it. So, interpretation is the key word here. We want to test the Hexham Abbey Bible against this George Ritschel method of adding pictures to a text. In the first part, we're going to ask, what does Ritschel want us to see when we open up the Hexham Abbey Bible? In the second part, we'll ask, what does the text want us to hear? So, what does Ritschel want us to see? We don't have to worry about graven images anymore. After all, he's Anglican. Pictures are okay. But what he did was something very interesting. He put virtually every engraving immediately in front of the biblical text to which it refers. And when you string out all of these engravings, of course, you have a cohesive story, just like you have in the Bible. So this is the first engraving I want to take a close look at, by Jan Wierix, 1585. What do we see when we gaze at this? Well, we see a party going on for sure. We see Jesus pointing to the servant, maybe to pour him some water. We know that it's water because there's a fellow back here getting water from the well and filling up these jars. See this little gremlin guy? He's probably saying, look over here. Look at these jars. Okay, we're looking at the jars. But what does it mean? I don't know. There's a party going on. And if you look real close, you can see a crown over her head and a laurel on his head. And apparently it was the custom back in the Middle Ages and so that a bride and bridegroom would put crowns on their head in order to show that they are good servants of whatever God they serve. And so maybe something like that is going on here. And maybe, back in the 1500s, somebody looking at this would recognize that and say, oh, there's a wedding party going on here. Okay. And in fact, there is a wedding party going on here. Jesus is doing something with the water. We don't know what. Can anybody see anything else in there? Yes.
Water to wine.
All right. How do you know there's wine?
Because of the chalices with the gremlin that's placed on there.
Does that tell you that there's wine?
Setting.
All right. The setting? Might it be because you know something about the story?
There's a group of people, there's water, and they want something a little bit more because it's celebratory experience being portrayed.
Okay. I don't see it. What I'm saying here is that there's a very limited amount of information that can be gotten just by looking at this engraving. If you see wine, more power to you. And if you do see wine, what do you see? Maybe Jesus is doing a miracle here and transforming water into wine. Okay, you see a miracle. I'll drink that.
Why is one of the bottles have a face with goat horns on?
You have to ask Ricardo that, but
Is that a mythological
This guy.
creature?
what is this?
Is that Bacchus?
It was very common in the 16th century to have those grotesque decorations. So they would, first of all, they would identify the status symbol of the family. We're talking about a wealthy family. So someone who could, for instance, have afford luxurious blankets such as this.
Ah.
And by the way, it's highly unlikely that Jesus ever would have been invited to this kind of a wedding. All right, so let's take a look at another picture. This is my favorite. I think it's the most powerful one in the Bible. It is one in which Jesus and his disciples are on a boat, and there's a storm on the sea, and the disciples are frightened out of their wits that perhaps they're going to drown, but Jesus is asleep. What a contrast that is. There's a storm going. Wow, is that powerful? But it's kind of hard to find out what's going on here. Maybe we should be expecting another miracle. I don't know. Let's move on. And thirdly, there is this very powerful engraving. Hans Collier, 1585. What do we see? We see three persons being crucified in various manners. We kind of can identify the central figure here as Jesus. He's got this crown of thorns, and maybe he has something about Christianity. Jesus wore a crown of thorns when he was crucified. And up and above here, there are some Latin initials, INRI, which stands for Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. But maybe if you hadn't read the text, you wouldn't know that either. So Jesus is perhaps being crucified. He's the central figure in the entire Bible. Okay. There's a storm coming up, maybe. The wind is blowing. Jerusalem is in the background. And here's the Temple of Jerusalem, probably the biggest, most famous structure in the world at that time, except maybe the pyramid. And here's a fellow, don't quite know yet who this is. What's he doing? It's kind of like, maybe. What's he praying for? Yeah. This is just bad news, folks. The whole thing is just bad news. These people are going to die. And then what? All right. Now let's take another look at the Hexham Abbey Bible and start a different way. What is the text telling us about these events? It's a matter of interpretation. Every time we approach a text or an engraving, we bring to it a lot of preconceptions that we have. We have a cultural background. We have a religious background. We have experiential background. And these things are called the horizon of understanding. And it's very difficult to see beyond one's own horizon. Another thing to note here is that the texts in the Bible are not simply days in the life of Jesus, as if you could take a picture from one day to the next and say, yeah, that's what Jesus was doing there. They're not like that at all. Instead, the writers here presupposed something that happened afterwards, namely the crucifixion and the resurrection. And that's what informed the writing that we have today. And I found that a good way to get at what is really going on in the text is to ask, what is God doing here? You can ask a lot of different questions to the text, but unless you get to this question, you haven't got to the heart of the matter. And remember, in the Hexham Abbey Bible, the pictures precede the text. The pictures are the first interpreters of the text. All right, so let's get back to our first engraving. This indeed is the wedding of Cana. And what does the story in the Bible say? It says that on the third day there was a wedding. And Jesus and his mother and his disciples were invited to this party. And after a while, his mother came to him and said, Jesus, there's no more wine. So Jesus calls the servants together, pours water into these jars, turns them into a great tasting wine. Everybody is happy, and that's it. It's a miracle. But is that all that is there? The story says that it was a sign of the glory of Jesus. And it begins by saying, on the third day there was a wedding. Now, this phrase, on the third day, has very significance to a Christian. On the third day, Jesus was raised from the dead. Very common. Every time you hear about the resurrection, on the third day, Jesus was raised from the dead. So maybe the writer is saying that there's something very significant going on here, something beyond a simple miracle. And when we ask the question, what is God doing here? We might remember we've just read chapter 1. And in chapter 1 it said, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, tabernacled among us. So somehow, in the first chapter of John, it's saying that Jesus somehow embodies the very presence of the God of Israel. And if we read the prophets, we know something about the prophets, we know that they often talk about God as the husband of Israel. And the church picks this up and talks about Jesus as the bridegroom of the church. And if you put these things together, of Jesus as the husband, things start to change here. Things start turning upside down. No longer is Jesus and his disciples the guests of this wedding, but rather everybody is the guest of Jesus, who is the husband, the bridegroom. And at this point, he is offering them something vastly more wonderful than they had ever had before. And so these guests of Jesus are actually witnesses to a sign of the glory of the kingdom of God. And how sad it is, really, when you think about it, that these people were there and they didn't notice that the beginning of their salvation was being played out in front of them. I really don't think you can get that from the picture. So we move on to the miracle of Christ on the sea. And as the story goes, Jesus was preaching about the kingdom of God on the land. He gets into a boat with his disciples. And in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, a storm arises. The disciples are beside themselves what to do. Jesus is sleeping. They wake up Jesus and say, Jesus, don't you care if we drown? Jesus gets up. He rebukes the wind and the sea. There's a great calm. The day is saved. They can live another day. But the disciples say, who is this that can rebuke the wind and the sea? Well, if you know your Old Testament, you'll know that this word rebuke is very special. Only God in the Old Testament rebukes anything. So when Jesus rebukes the wind and the sea, I mean, no human being can tell the sea and the wind what to do, right? God rebukes the wind and the sea, and there's a great calm. And just in case you don't get who Jesus is at this point, in the next chapter, Jesus heals a man who then says to Jesus, who are you? Jesus of Nazareth, Son of the Most High God. Now we know who it is. Well, when I look at this picture in regard to the text that underlies it, I'm encouraged to read on. I see this contrast going on, and it's wonderful. It doesn't tell the whole story, but it urges me to read on. Finally, the crucifixion. Here we have absolute maximum contrast. Jesus, who can rebuke the wind and the sea, is nailed to a cross. He is finished. He is under the thumb of all the reigning authorities. And yet he is the Son of God. What do you make of this? Kind of hard to tell. There's Peter in the background. We know this is Peter because there are some keys here. And now since we've read the whole Bible, we know that he represents the church, or maybe the papacy, or maybe just an average Christian. That's kind of hard to tell. But we know for certain that he wasn't there at the time. He had fled along with the rest of the disciples. Now, if you know your Old Testament, you realize that Jesus, being King of the Jews, it's very significant. Who is the King of Israel, after all? It's presupposed everywhere in the Old Testament that God himself is the King. He is the rightful and true King of Israel. regardless of how many human kings there are, God is the king. So perhaps what we have here is the God of Israel being crucified in the midst of other persons being crucified. And so I believe what this represents is that engravings really have very limited interpretive power if you don't have the text to go along with it. How do we assess then the Hexham Abbey Bible? It seems to me that it's very easy for the pictures to dominate the text, for you to be so focused on these pictures that you ignore what's going on in the text. The pictures, in fact, seem to freeze a certain interpretation, an interpretation that's embodied in the pictures, and it's frozen there for all time, regardless of any other kind of research that might be applied to the text. What's missing? There's something very important missing from the Hexham Abbey Bible. I mentioned before about the resurrection. That is the only picture of the resurrection in the entire Bible. There are no pictures of resurrection appearances, for example. There are no pictures of the ascension. There are no pictures of the coming last judgment. All that is missing. Why? How do we assess Ritschel? If we're kind to him and we look at his Bible with the eyes of faith, we see an encouragement to read on, I believe. It entices us to look further, to read the text. Or perhaps maybe it seduces us into not reading the text. Maybe we just like the pictures so much that we ignore the text. That's a possibility too. So then I ask, should pictures be in Bible? It's a picture this is a question we all need to answer. My answer, humbly spoken, your beware. Thank you very much. I welcome your questions.
Good. Pat, would you like to have
No, I don't need it. I'm just wondering about the cleanliness of the Bible, which you said was so clean it was
Yes.
Cleaner than any other Bible that you had seen from that period.
Yes.
What do you think that says about the uses to which it was put?
Very
especially
limited use.
the educational purposes.
Yeah, I think it was very, very limited use. There are no dog ears or markings of any kind in the Bible. I think it was a nice Bible to begin with that Ritschel took. He put his pictures in. He realized that the New Book of Common Prayer had made his Bible obsolete. He put it up on the shelf at Hexham Abbey, left it to his son, passed it on down, kept clean.
So
Never
despite the illustrations, it wasn't really used?
That's right. Yes.
I had a question. Are these engravings seen in other books preceding this?
No. These engravings from the 1500s are not seen in any other English Bible ever. But there are engravings like this that are seen from around 1600. I'm sorry, 1660. Yes.
Is it known how many copies of this Bible were made?
I don't know of any at this one.
Just one.
Right. And while you're at it, there's a possibility out there, by the way, that Ritschel broke up a whole Bible that had Old Testament and New Testament in it, put the Old Testament separately and put engravings in there. That might be out there somewhere. Yes?
The Book of Common Prayer part of this new creation, did it have the New Testament readings and also the Psalms attached?
Yes.
It's full and complete as
Yes, it is complete.
interesting.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, sir.
Where did he get the sections and engravings? Did he just
Well,
carry them with him from?
Well, he was the researcher for Jan Comenius, and he traveled all over Europe and picked them up along the way because he was trying to figure out the text and the picture idea. So, you like these, I guess?
It was his collection.
I presume. Yeah.
Refresh my memory on the process of engraving. So these are actually prints of something that was a literal engraving.
Yeah, so somebody engraved a copper plate backwards,
Okay.
right? And then it was printed onto a piece of paper.
Right.
Pressed
Does
on.
anybody know where these copper plates are?
I don't.
Few of them, very few of them are, for instance, at Albertina Museum in Vienna, at the Kunsthistorisches Museum, because as early as the 16th century, they became collectible items as well. Especially the ones for renowned artists such as Peter Brügge or many others included in the Bible, such as Martin van Hemskel. They were so highly regarded that not only the preliminary drawings or the engravings, but also the copper plates had become collectible.
Right.
So we do have a few.
So where did these Flemish artists learn the art of engraving with these Renaissance? Like,
Well, I would invite you to come to my course. A semester-long explanation.
I mean, that's an incredibly precise skill. Not only the ability to create the figures like that, but to do the handwork necessary to, without.
It took sometimes over 15 years of training, and they would start at the age sometimes of 4 or 5. So they would become part of a workshop in which they would be educated also to learn how to read and how to use those images in a metaphorical sense. So not only, I have a different interpretation, a different take, of course, of how engraving could open up new horizons for either other kinds of narratives, not only subordinated to the Bible, but also implying different values in different problems. So it was a very laborious process with engraving. It usually started with a drawing, and then from a drawing, the translation into a copper engraving.
I'm a printmaker myself, and I find it hard to believe, to comprehend, that they would put all that work into making a copper plate and only make one print off of it.
No. They did a lot of prints.
Oh, okay.
Some of them over 2,000 remaining prints. The difference being that they were only this ones compiled within the Bible. In this particular edition.
Thank you. That feels much better.
So they had this initial run, which produced the best engravings. And then after a while, the engravings kind of got messed up, and so maybe 50 years later, somebody else would go over those engravings again and run them off again.
Okay, thank you.
I appreciate your theological interpretation in regards to the miracle in Canaan, and I never thought of it that way, that was foreshadowing Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. In that sense, I never thought of it that way, and I appreciate that insight.
Yes.
What you said, that this was read as a kind of presentation to the bishop.
To the bishop, right.
So the act of making the book would have been between one kind of theological mind to another, so that you wouldn't come to those pictures without knowing the text.
Well, but that is certainly true, absolutely. But since we're not there, we're not the bishop, we're not Ritschel, we're just ordinary folks.
Right, but who would open the book in that naive way, in an abbey context?
Well, he was trying to make a point with the bishop that he was Anglican.
I'm sorry?
He was trying to make the point to the bishop that he was an Anglican.
Yes.
At least that's a possibility. Yes, sir?
Bruce, I lost it.
Sorry.
The Puritans, Bruce.
Yeah.
What was the difference between the Puritan, the Anglican, and the Roman Catholic Church? In history,
Well,
as a former teacher in history, we knew that the Anglicans and the Roman Catholics were at odds.
Yeah.
Where did the Puritans come in there?
Yeah, that's good.
Well, in regard to this, you know, they're the more reformed wing of the Protestant church. But here, the important thing is that they just didn't like pictures and Bibles. Now, Anglicans and Lutherans and Catholics had no problem with it at all. And by the way, folks, the entire world had no problem with pictures and Bibles. Only the English did.
Have you found in your search for, the physical disposition of this Bible, have you found spiritual depth that you didn't have before as well? And did it open your eyes to certain spiritual things in your relationship with God that?
Well, I'd have to say no. But on the other hand, it gave me a real deep appreciation for engravings.
I wondered if you had any other plans for exhibiting the Bible, or
If you have some ideas, I'm all ears.
I have an idea.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the Green family that have, they're out of Tulsa, Oklahoma? They're the family that orchestrated the Hobby Lobby stores and the Mardells, and they have a Bible museum, and they established a Green Family Foundation, and they have a museum, and they collect all kinds of ancient manuscripts. Yeah, and they probably would appreciate having it displayed in their museums, sometime.
We'll find out.
The other engravings that you acquired.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about how and why.
Oh my God. Well, after I discovered these engravings, I went engraving crazy, and I bought all the engravings I could from about this period of time. And out of that whole store, Ricardo picked 35 for the exhibit. Maybe there'll be another exhibit with more engravings.
I'm ready.
But as far as I know, this is one of the largest concentrations of these engravings on the West Coast. And by the way, a lot of these engravings come from a book that was made in 1580 to 1585 that only had engravings in it of the whole story of the Bible. There was about 330 engravings in it. And of course, only if you were very wealthy could you afford this. And the most wealthy people illuminated them in gold and silver and lapis lazuli and all kinds of different things. And I saw one at the New York Public Library a couple of years ago. Absolutely stunning, fabulous. But here's my point. There are only 9 of these books in the world, and 4 of them are colored. So only 5 of the books exist in the world. The rest are spread out in the museum.
In this particular Bible, did you purchase it from out of the U.S. or is it already in the U.S.?
I don't know the answer to that question, because once I realized that there might be an Old Testament out there, I did my very best to try to find who actually owned this Bible, and the closest I could get was somebody saying it came from an estate sale.
Thank you all very much for your questions. Thank you, Bruce, again for your presentation. And now I look very much forward to seeing you all again on April the 4th for our 4th lecture. Thank you.